Hey, deserving listeners, this is chapter 2 in my attachment theory deep dive. Let me tell you something. I love attachment theory. It explains so many things and is such a good guide, not only for my clinical work, but also just for my personal life. Attachment theory involves so many different things. It's related to so many different things that we think about, the way we relate to each other. I would guess that every fight you've ever been in with your partner is 99% related to attachment theory. Every unfortunate personality trait of yours or of anyone you've ever met is probably related to attachment theory. Nearly every diagnosis in the DSM is related to attachment development. And don't take my word for it, this is heavily researched. In the past 10, 20 years, thousands of scientists have looked into the connection between attachment theory development and relationships, divorce, psychopathology, etc. And so conspiracy theories, like people who are into conspiracy theories, for example, there's a relation to attachment theory. Pedophilia, pornography use, alcoholism, let alone anxiety, depression, this kind of thing. So it's incredibly important, I think, for everyone, lay people and otherwise, clinicians, to understand attachment theory in its entirety, because it's very important. So in this episode, I'm going to talk for probably 5+ hours about attachment theory. Chapter 1, the previous chapter, was about the history of attachment theory, mainly talking about John Bowlby. But this episode is going to be a deep dive into the actual theory. And this is probably the core episode of this deep dive series on attachment theory. I'm going to fully explain the theory, and I'm going to present hundreds of studies that will illuminate the nuances of the theory. But first, I want to present two different stories about attachment. These are two actual individuals who have what I would consider to be somewhat typical presentations of insecure attachment. As a caveat before I tell these stories, I just want to say that these are not universal. When we're trying to categorize or, provide a typology of human experience, we always run into problems because there's a wide variety of people and presentations and lives. So just take that into account. So the first story I have here is what I would consider to be a somewhat typical story of what we would call avoidant attachment. So someone who avoids attachment as for reasons related to their upbringing. So this is a boy born into a family. He grows up in a cold family, a family that wasn't extremely warm or loving. Wasn't a terrible family, but just not extremely warm. He was a happy kid, so his parents didn't feel the need to pay close attention to him. He was often left to his own devices as a child. His parents praised him for being so independent and responsible. Sometimes his parents were overly stern with him. They would discipline him in harsh ways, but not too harsh. He was good at sports, and he was good in school. In high school, he went through a tough breakup with a girlfriend, and he decided he would never allow himself to be vulnerable like that ever again. In college, he dated women, but he never allowed himself to get too close. He broke a lot of hearts. He drank a lot of alcohol. He had a lot of sex. He sometimes bragged too much. In his 20s, he eventually let his guard down and he fell in love again. His girlfriend complained about how distant he was sometimes. After a couple years, he found himself often fantasizing about being single again. Excuse me. But he didn't really talk about that. He just fantasized in his own mind about being single again. He never really talked about his inner life with other people. He didn't think others would care. And he didn't think that others would really understand. He was still drinking socially. Sometimes he drank too much. Sometimes he worried about his marijuana use as well. He often felt alone, but he didn't know how to reach out to other people. People saw him as being very strong, very emotionally strong. People saw him as someone who never really got over-emotional. People saw him as someone who had built a very good life. He was very dependable. He eventually got married. It was a good marriage, but then the marriage started to get kind of distant, kind of disengaged. Then it got really distant. They fought sometimes. He thought that she was very illogical and was too emotional. She thought that he was emotionless and too intellectual and too narcissistic. Then his wife said that she wanted a divorce. To him, this was completely out of the blue. He was devastated. Someone told him that he should go to therapy, so he did. He didn't really want to go, but he was in a crisis, so he thought he should go. In therapy, he didn't know what to talk about, but over time he learned that he had an avoidant attachment style. He avoided his attachment needs by appearing strong and independent, but deep down, he was suffering from chronic loneliness. And his independent nature pushed other people away. And through this therapeutic relationship with a therapist that understood attachment theory, he began to heal from his early attachment injuries. Okay, so that is a story, what I would consider to be a somewhat typical story of someone with insecure attachment, or specifically avoidant attachment. And I'll go into more detail on what avoidant attachment is. This next story is what I would consider to be a typical story of what we would call a preoccupied attachment style. This is a girl. She grows up in a chaotic family. Her parents fought a lot, and they fought in front of her. Her dad would drink too much and disappear overnight sometimes. She remembered trying to soothe her mom when she was upset. She was okay in school. She had a lot of friends. She was more mature than her peers. Her teachers praised her a lot for being more mature, being more responsible. She was good in drama class. In high school, she thought about boys a lot. She had a tendency to develop intense crushes on boys. And she would later say that she was always attracted to the bad boys. She tried to find Mr. Right, but she kept getting hurt, really hurt. As an adult, she had a number of intense relationships with boys, with young men, romantic relationships, but also with friends. She tended to have intense best friend relationships that sometimes ended badly. Most of the time, the romantic relationships would end quite badly. A number of times, she thought she actually had met Mr. Right. With each one, she would fantasize about getting married and having a family with him. With some of them, they would even talk about getting married, quite intensely. She really liked talking about marriage and building a family life together. She really liked to talk about marriage and talk about building a family and a future together. She often thought about that. She often talked about that. Then one of her boyfriends cheated on her, so she ended that relationship very quickly. Then another boyfriend refused to plan for the future. He would get very upset or distant when she would bring the topic up, so they broke up over time. Another boyfriend became too emotional when they fought, and they broke up over that issue. After each breakup, she was devastated. She would think she was so stupid for falling in love again. She would think she was so stupid for allowing herself to be tricked by these pigs that were these boyfriends. She universally thought all of her ex-boyfriends were not good boys, that they were terrible people. I'm trying not to swear. And she had trouble controlling her emotions. Sometimes when she was particularly stressed out, she would think about suicide. She also started to realize that other people didn't care as much about loyalty as she did. She realized that she had a lot of love to give, but no one really cared about love these days. She would say, I have so much love to give, but it just seems like no one else cares about love and attachment as much as I do. Sometimes she cried herself to sleep at night, hoping that someone would really understand her, but she was really quite hopeless that she would ever find someone that would really understand her. She decided to go to therapy. She found a good therapist who listened well. She really liked her therapist. She wanted to go to therapy all the time. She convinced her therapist to see her twice a week. She felt like things were going really well in therapy, but then her therapist seemed bored one day, and she got the sense that her therapist didn't really care. So in the next session, she was quiet and reserved because she didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she should say anything. And when the therapist asked about it, she didn't know what to say. Over time, the therapist told her that she had signs of preoccupied attachment. This led to a lot of discoveries for her in her explorations with her therapist. and she began to heal from her attachment injuries through this therapeutic relationship. So that's a typical story of someone with preoccupied attachment. If you can relate to either of these stories, then I encourage you to continue listening, because in each of these chapters, I'm going to talk about these two presentations quite a bit, because they're really quite common. As I said in the beginning, these are not universal. It's not like every preoccupied person presents this way. It's impossible to categorize all of human experience in this way. But the elements are similar, and I'll get more into that later. So I apologize to non-patrons. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to hear this whole episode and all the other chapters on my attachment deep dive, you have to become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. That's patreon.com. When you become a patron, you'll get instructions on how to access these deep dives, along with hundreds of other deep dives, including deep dives on narcissistic personality disorder, and several other personality disorders, suicide, other important issues. So go to patreon.com and become a patron now.